Hello, good morning and welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Jill Rutter, I'm Programme Director here, but my role today is to chair this briefing on the Budget and Spending Review 2015, which is of course the first time we've had a Conservative budget and spending review since the late 1990s, so of massive interest, as we can see from the phenomenal turnout today. This replicates an event that we did very early on in the life of the Institute in 2010, when we were joined by our good friends and colleagues from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and did a briefing on the prospects for that spending review. We're not going back to mark our own homework to see whether what we said actually happened, but anyway. What we're going to do today is Carl Emerson, Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and Julie McRae, Deputy Director of the Institute for Government, are both going to give presentations. Those of you wanting lots of graphs are going to be very satisfied. There are a lot of graphs to set out what the backdrop is on public spending and some thoughts about some of the challenges that potentially make the 2015 public spending round different to the spending round we saw in 2010. We're then going to take quick fire questions and answers for the remaining time. For those of you who've had to go into the overspill room, when we move to the Q&A session, do come into this room to ask questions. We don't want you to be excluded in there. So Julian and Carl are both going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, we hope. They've got a lot of slides to get through, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carl Emerson.
Thank you, Jill. So I'm going to go through the challenge that the government faces in its desire to eliminate the deficit by 2018-19, which the Conservative Party Manifesto committed it to doing. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the public spending side, because it's on the spending side where most of the action is to come. And I'm going to talk about kind of some of the detailed trade-offs that the government will face and some of the detail that was absolutely missing from the Conservative Party Manifesto in terms of how they want to eliminate the deficit. So as background, this slide shows you spending as a share of GDP in green, tax as a share of GDP in orange, the gap between the two, the deficit. You can see that the coalition successfully halved the deficit from about 10% of GDP in 2009-10 to about 5% in the financial year that's just finished. And if they keep to the plans for this year, it will fall to 4% of GDP this year. That is still a relatively large deficit, both by UK historical standards and compared to many other countries. In the March budget, the OBR's forecasts implied that tax receipts would grow a bit over the next few years and that spending would continue to fall as a share of GDP, bringing us to a position of surplus in 2018-19. That would be the first surplus since the early 2000s. Tax receipts going up in particular because of a tax rise coming in next April when contracting out for defined benefit schemes ends and the employers and employees offering and receiving those schemes will pay more in national insurance. But most of the action on the spending side. So what did the Conservative Party Manifesto pledge? Well, on the tax side, our calculations suggest a small net tax rise from policies to be announced. That's because the Conservatives have pledged to raise £5 billion from new measures to crack down on anti-avoidance, but they haven't provided any detail at all on what those measures would be. And that's just slightly more than enough to offset what we think is about a £4 billion net tax cut from the specific measures they set out in their manifesto. So that's tax cuts on things like inheritance tax and income tax. So a small net tax rise. On the spending side, the Conservatives were very explicit about how much they wanted to spend in total over the next few years, spending slightly more than what the March budget implied. But this would still see spending falling to its lowest share of national income in 2018-19 since 1999-2000. So small tax rise, spending being cut as a share of GDP, being cut slightly less quickly than the March budget implies, but still by enough, if delivered, to deliver a surplus in 18-19. So let's look at the spending commitments in a bit more detail. This graph shows you total public spending in real terms, so how much spending in pounds billions being spent after economy-wide inflation. You can see it's been falling since 2010-11. The manifesto said that there would be a 1% a year real cut to public spending in 16-17 and 17-18, followed by a real freeze to public spending in 18-19, followed by a year in which public spending would grow in line with the economy. The OBR decided to describe a profile like this as a roller coaster. If the plans up to 18-19 are delivered, it would mean that spending in real terms would be about at the same level as it was in 2008-9. But note, the population has grown since then, so real terms per capita public spending will be back to the level that we enjoyed back in 2004-5. So you might think that these look like relatively modest cuts to public spending. The Prime Minister, for example, has said, well, we've only got to take £1 out of every 100 that the government spends each year for the next couple of years, and then we're there. He's explained that he thinks any business in the country could do this, and government should be no different. Unfortunately, one problem is that it's actually harder than this because there are underlying pressures that are pushing up many areas of public spending. So what's known as annually managed expenditure, if you sat back and did nothing, is forecast to rise quite considerably. And some of these things are pretty much outside the government's control. So debt interest spending forecast to rise very dramatically over the next few years because we're still borrowing a lot of money, so the amount of debt we have is growing, and also effective interest rates on that debt are forecast to rise. Spending on public service pensions forecast to grow because the numbers receiving those pensions is going up. We've got the baby boomers hitting their normal pension ages and retiring. We've got pensioners living for longer. And state pension spending forecast to rise because the average amount we're paying each pensioner is going up because, in particular, women are reaching state pension age with greater entitlements and successive governments have implemented reforms which made the state pension system, on average, more generous. That means that a given cut to overall spending implies a deeper cut to departmental spending. And of course, we also have the decision to increase spending in some areas and the decision not to cut some other areas of spending, which also increases the size of the cuts that are faced elsewhere. So one area where the government has pledged to make cuts is social security spending. The government has said it will take £12 billion out of the social security budget by 2017-18. We spend £220 billion on benefits, state pensions and tax credits, but the Conservative Party manifesto says that the state pension and universal pensioner benefits will be protected. So if you look at unprotected social security spending, you'll see that the government needs to cut that by about 10% in just 2 years, and if it does that, it will reduce that spending as a share of GDP back to the level seen in 1990-91. It's announced some specific measures to help bring it towards the 12 billion goal, a 1 billion saving from freezing most working age benefits for 2 years, a reduction in the household benefit cap, and the removal of housing benefit for some 18 to 21-year-olds. In total, those three specific measures will save it about a tenth of what it needs of the 12 billion that it needs to find. So that leaves, roughly speaking, about £10 billion to find in 2 years, and that needs to come from things that are other than just increasing things less quickly than inflation. We've kind of done the inflation saving and it doesn't get you very much in the current, we've done the cash freeze and it doesn't get you very much in the low inflation world that we're in. How difficult is it to find £10 billion in just 2 years? Well, if we look at the gross cuts to benefits made by the coalition over the last 5 years, and we exclude the policies which were about indexing things less quickly than inflation, we find that they actually found 15 billion over 5 years. So they found 15 billion over 5 years. The Conservative government needs to find 10 billion over 2 years. What might it look to cut? Well, this pie chart shows you unprotected benefit spending, so spending on benefits outside of state pensions and universal pensioner benefits, £125 billion. We spend 30 billion on tax credits, another 26 billion on housing benefit, another 37 billion on disability and incapacity benefits. The other big one is child benefit, but the Prime Minister made it clear this week that that won't be cut in the next 5 years. So we're looking at taking about 10% out. I can give you some examples of things you could do. I'm not advocating these policies, but they're a way of describing how difficult it might be, or easy, depending on your perspective. Ooh. So you could, for example, say, we're going to cut tax credits, we're going to reduce what's known as the child element of the child tax credit. We'll cut that by 30%. We'll take it back to the level it was at in 2003-04. That would save you £5 billion a year. Bringing it back to its 3-4 level saves you so much because Labour was increasing that part of the benefit system so dramatically. Why was it doing that? Well, it was doing it because it's a relatively well-targeted way at lifting children out of poverty. So if you go for this cut to the benefit system, we estimate you'll put about 300,000 more children below the poverty line. Housing benefit, £26 billion a year spent on that. You could, for example, say that all housing benefit recipients have to pay at least 10% of their rent. That would save you £2.5 billion a year. Incapacity and disability benefits, well, these are one benefit that actually do go to people who are not on low incomes, of course, in part to compensate them for the disabilities that they have. You could decide to tax them. That would save you about £1.5 billion a year. So that's just some examples of the kind of policies one might consider if looking to take £12 billion out of this spending. So that now brings us on to departmental spending cuts, the other part of public spending. And to step back, what's the coalition done so far? Well, over the 5 years, starting in 10-11, they've delivered what looks like an average real cut of 9.7%. Now, it's worth saying that's slightly less than was planned over the 4 years to 2014-15, back in the spending review they held in the autumn of 2010. So they haven't quite delivered the cuts in real terms that they intended. Now, that's despite the fact the cash budgets for day-to-day spending have actually been cut back further. They've been more successful than they initially, or more dramatic than they initially intended back in 2010. So why have they not achieved the real cut they're looking for? Well, it's two reasons. Firstly, inflation has turned out to be lower than expected, so a given cash budget has turned out to be more generous in real terms. And secondly, they chose to top up the capital spending plans. So they're spending more on capital than they intended back in 2010. And of course, the cuts over this period have been far from evenly spread. The coalition chose to increase spending on overseas aid and to provide relative protection from cuts for both the NHS and for day-to-day spending on schools. So this protection, in particular for the NHS and schools, meant that some areas of government had to face much larger cuts, and we've seen many unprotected departments seeing their budgets having already been cut by a quarter or more. That's departments including the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the Department for Communities and Local Government, and the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. So that's the 9.7% that's already been taken out of government departments. If you do the £12 billion of social security cuts and you keep to the manifesto commitment for total public spending, the blue line shows you what the path of departmental spending will look like over the next 4 years. You can see that in 2018-19, spending would be 6.6% lower than it will be in the current year. So that's a real cut to be found in the next spending review of £23.8 billion. It's an average cut of 2.2% per year, which represents a slight acceleration of the 2% a year that departments have been delivering so far. So one justification for trying to do £12 billion worth of welfare cuts is that you want to keep to the total spending limits and you don't want to see the cuts to government departments accelerate any faster than this. And if you do these cuts by 18-19, on average, government departments will have 15.6% less than they had in 2010-11. That's a total real cut of £62.8 billion. But again, these cuts won't be evenly spread. The Conservative Manifesto has pledged to protect or indeed to increase some areas of spending. So aid spending is to grow in real terms, as it's expected to be kept at 0.7% of gross national income. School spending is going to be, at least cash spending per pupil is to be protected. And on health spending, the Conservative Manifesto commits to spend at least an additional £8 billion by 2020. So we're going to assume that the £8 billion is fed in linearly, so after half the years the NHS gets half the money, and we can work out what's left for other government departments. So I told you on the last slide there was a cut of £23.8 billion. We think that the increase in spending is going to cost the government £6.2 billion. That means the total cut you need from elsewhere is actually £30 billion over the next 3 years. That's a cut to those departments of 15.3% on average over the next 3 years, which would bring the cumulative cut across those departments up to almost 1/3. And of course, within that, the government's got difficult trade-offs. How much to spend on law and order, how much to spend on defence, how much to spend on transport. To give you one example, supposing the government chose to freeze the defence budget in real terms. So that would continue to see defence spending falling as a share of GDP, but it would also increase the cuts required elsewhere from the 15.3% to 18.7%, or indeed the cumulative cut outside of schools, the NHS, aid and defence would reach 37% between 2010 and 2018-19. And that includes areas such as the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the Department for Communities and Local Government, Business Innovation and Skills, and Transport. The cuts also have implications for Scotland. We can't be sure exactly what would happen to the block grant for Scotland. It depends on the allocation of spending on each department. But we think that given the total departmental spending awards and the coalition government's decision, and the government's decision to protect things like schools and health, which are devolved matters, it seems pretty clear that the block grant to Scotland would be cut, but it would be cut by less than the 6.6% average cut that government departments are facing. So how's the government going to go about doing this? Well, one thing it will have to look at will be the public sector wage bill. A large part of public spending on public services will be wages. And indeed, that's one thing the government has been cutting so far. So between 2010 and the end of 2014, general government employment has been cut by 376,000. The OBR has forecast a fall of 80,000 in the current financial year. So general government employment is now down to the level of the early 2000s, and as a share of the workforce is now at its lowest level since the early 1970s. The government's also been squeezing public sector pay, and we've looked at the level of public sector pay compared to private sector pay and taken into account characteristics like the experience and education of those workers. And it seems pretty clear that public sector pay grew more quickly than private sector pay during the financial crisis, and that may well not have been intended. And the squeeze delivered so far to public sector pay has kind of unwound all of that increase. So we're now at the position where the differential between public and private sector pay is back to kind of pre-crisis levels. And there's going to be a very difficult trade-off between how much to pay public sector workers and how many public sector workers we can afford, given the amount of money we're spending in total on public services. So if, for example, public sector pay increases in line with what the OBR forecast back in March, we estimate you'd have to reduce the size of general government employment by about another 500,000, which would reduce it to the lowest level since 1974. An alternative might be to choose to CPI index public sector pay through to 2018-19. That would still require a further 350,000 reduction in general government employment. So will these cuts to spending be delivered? Well, I think on the positive side, it's worth noting that the coalition government was successful in keeping broadly to the spending plans it set out in 2010. In cash terms, in terms of day-to-day spending on public services, it's actually cut by more than it intended, and it's day-to-day spending that the new government is looking to cut over the next 3 years. But there are reasons to think that delivering cuts in this Parliament will be harder than they were in the last Parliament. First, as I've already said, squeezing public sector pay is going to be more difficult now because we hope, touch wood, private sector wages will be growing more quickly. Secondly, presumably, the government has already delivered the efficiency savings that were easiest to identify and easiest to deliver. Similarly, presumably, the programmes that have been judged to be low value have already been scrapped. We've also got, I mentioned at the start, this tax rise coming in April for the ending of contracting out for those in defined benefit schemes. Well, the majority of people in defined benefit schemes are actually working in the public sector. So that's a Nhs rise for public sector employers of £3.3 billion that has to be found from these spending totals. We've also done a revaluation of the public service pension schemes, and that's going to push up the amount that public sector employers have to put into the pot by about £1.1 billion. And the government's been making some commitments outside of the areas of schools and the NHS, which will have to be found through cuts elsewhere. So we're extending free childcare. There was press stories about this earlier this week, which the Conservatives have cost at £350 million. We've got new tax-free childcare coming in from September at a cost of £800 million. We're abolishing the cap on HE student numbers at a cost of £0.7 billion. And we're implementing the Deal Not Social Care package at a cost of £1 billion. All of this increases the size of cuts that needs to be found elsewhere to keep within the overall spending envelope. And of course, the population continues to grow and it continues to age, which will be very important for services such as social care. So to conclude, there's a manifesto commitment to cut spending through to 2018-19, and that is necessary if what you want to do is to eliminate the deficit without announcing significant net tax rises. But underlying pressures are going to push up spending in some areas. So whereas the Prime Minister keeps highlighting the fact he only needs to find £1 in every 100 that the government spends over the next 2 years, I think that seriously underestimates the size of the challenge that we face. Even if the £12 billion of social security cuts are found and delivered, the cuts to departmental spending are set to accelerate slightly over the next 3 years. So there's a further 6.6% to come from departments over the next 3 years, which would bring the cumulative cut up to 15.6%. NHS and overseas aid spending is set to rise in real terms. Cash school spending per pupil is to be protected from cuts, which means that unprotected departments are set to be cut by a further 15.3% over the next 3 years, bringing the cumulative cut that those departments have faced up to almost a third over the period since 2010. And if, for example, you decided to freeze the defence budget, still allow it to fall as a share of GDP, the cumulative cut to the other departments that are unprotected would rise to 18.7% over the next 3 years, or 37% over the 8 years starting in 2010-11. So I think what we can be clear about is that meeting these spending plans will be far from easy. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, we're going to move swiftly on to Julian to give some reflections, a bit of a wider context for the spending round beyond the numbers. So, Julian.
Thank you. And good morning. I just want to take you through some of the processes and the things that will probably be going on around the budget and spending review over the next few months. Some of you, I suspect, were welcoming back to the Institute. Possibly some of you were here in 2010 when Carl and I did relatively similar presentations. That shouldn't really come as that much of a surprise to people. If you look internationally and historically at what's happened when countries get in the type of fiscal situation the UK got itself into in the late 2000s, you find that it's very rare actually for people to first go at sorting out their fiscal problems for it to actually succeed. People talked a lot, including ourselves, about the experience of Canada in the 1980s and 1990s. The first problems they had with their deficit was after their 1984 election. The 1988 election, they still had problems with their deficit and had to have another go at trying to sort it out. So not much surprise that we're still here, but what can we do this time round? First of all, just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to cover a little bit of the strong track record for the government on spending control, touching on some of Carl's issues, but a few others besides. But the pressures we face in 2015 are substantially different and greater to the ones we faced in 2010. Carl's touched on a few. I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the pressures building inside services themselves. Therefore, looking at the budget and spending review, what do we really need to happen? What do we need to see coming out of it? It needs to set departmental budgets that will eliminate the deficit, the manifesto commitment from the government. That's one thing the Treasury very good at spreadsheets. Devise implementable plans that will actually maintain service quality when implementing those numbers. This is well, we'll come to that, but a tricky task in itself. And then finally, as we move forward and those reforms become reality, can we ensure that we're maintaining the political sustainability of what happens? Any look internationally at this says, we didn't see it in the last Parliament, but things go off the rails when you haven't got the political support. If that disappears, no government will be able to take through the types of measures that we'll be talking about coming out of the budget and spending review. So right, let me take you through each of these in a little more detail. Coalition spending record. First thing to say, why, if we haven't sorted out the problems we talked about in 2010, do we think the government did very well on spending? Well, the answer is, of course, the thing that blew it off course was largely a lack of growth and the consequent lack of tax revenue. It wasn't on the spending side. It kept, as Carl said, pretty much to the departmental spending budgets. It's a quick graph just showing the 13-14 outturns against the cash outturns, against the cash plans that were in the 2010 spending review. There's a few big increases there, things like MOD and FCO, but that was largely expected. That was a lot to do with foreign contingencies which were built into special reserves being allocated. For the vast majority of departments, they were actually undershooting their cash budgets compared to the plans that were set out in the last spending review. The third thing that went on inside this and spending control record, perceptions of service quality and what was actually happening. What did the public feel was happening to public services? And we can take a little look at this. This is from a poll the BBC commissioned back in 2013, which was asking people about what changes in service quality have been like in the previous 5 years. Question on overall public services. What do people feel happened to overall public services? The graph is showing the proportion of people, what percentage of people thought services had got worse compared to the number who thought they got better. So 25% of people effectively thought, on average, a net amount was 25% of people thinking services had got worse overall. Not the most important number in this. Sounds like a very negative story for the government. If you start asking people about specific services, well, one, road maintenance. We really don't like potholes and we don't think we're doing very well on that. Much, much worse overall view of the public on that. But actually, a lot of other services, people thought they got worse over the 5 years, but not by anywhere near as much as they thought that abstract question had worked. And some big things like hospitals and things like that in there. And actually, for quite a lot of services in 2013, people were saying their perception was that they'd actually got better over that 5 years. And again, some big services in there. You've got a lot of local government services inside that group, GP surgeries, you've got schools and colleges in there. So while the cuts were going on, that perception from the public that they were being directly affected was actually relatively, very ambiguous story. And that's what really matters for the politics, not can you get an answer to a question in the abstract that says people are relatively dissatisfied. What's happening in their own lives? So I'm sure the government will want to be thinking about, can it replicate that going forward? So those are the sort of big things in the coalition spending control record that the Conservative government, I'm sure, will want to continue. But as I said earlier, pressures now are much greater than they were in 2015. It's much harder. Departments are tending to find it actually quite a bit harder now to keep to those budgets. So we haven't got the final figures yet for 1450 and the cash out turns there, but it looks like more departments will actually have spent more than was planned in the 2010 than had happened in 13-14. But the other thing, if you start to look in a little bit more detail, places like NHS trusts and foundation trusts within the health service, they're starting to show some quite significant deficits in 14-15 that weren't there earlier in the previous Parliament. The second thing about public concern, 2013 was when that poll was taken that I just took you through. If you look at some of the later polling data, this is the proportion of people naming the top issues facing Britain. You'll see that the NHS has had a sharp rise in the last year or so. Now, some of you might think this is just a return to the long-run norm, our general perception that the NHS is in perpetual crisis. That may be true, but the point about this graph is the difference between where we are now and where we were in 2010, when we were at historically low levels of concern about the NHS, and indeed quite a few other public services. The final thing, which probably underlies a lot of these figures, is the real evidence of pressures inside public services on their quality. So just continuing the sort of NHS theme, let's take the most high-profile thing that most people will know, accident emergency target for waiting 4 hours. 95% of people should be seen within 4 hours. That's the line from 2006 running through to 2014. There's a pretty clear trend in that and a very big effect. You can see this. You can see winters in that graph, but there's also a trend that this winter was a lot worse than others. Not just the health service, look at some other services. Prisons, for example. Falling staff numbers in prisons. There's been quite a reduction in the amount of staff in prisons, and prisoner population has been roughly the same. It's gone up and down over that period. Difficult to say whether this is an efficiency. Remember, if we want to actually reduce spending, pay bills are a big part of that. Carl's talked about wages, but reducing staff numbers has also been a big thing that's been going on. Or is it a building up of a pressure in the system? Really impossible to tell from a lot of our debates, which are often in terms of inputs, number of people working there. If you start to look at some of the service quality indicators, you start to get a picture which might be a bit more getting you into this. So this is just rising serious assaults in prisons, usually prisoners on other prisoners. That's quite clearly a pressure within the service. So those are sort of things that are built into the system, and they're quite different and strikingly different to where we were in 2010, when actually if you talk to people running public services, you found a guarded confidence They felt they could see where they could make cuts. Some of those things Carl was talking about, the obvious low-value areas, the bits where there was a bit of leeway to get rid of. Talk to people now around public services and you find they are much more concerned about where exactly do the reductions come from. And I think they're backed, that's clear in the numbers that are coming out on service quality at the moment. Okay, so we face tasks going ahead. What do we need to do in the budget and spending review? Well, the first task I outlined was setting departmental budgets to make sure that we actually achieve the deficit reduction. And I'll just take you through a few of the time points that are going to happen over this process. So when are we likely to have the final announcements on things? Budget fixed for the 8th of July. 4 different things I think we can expect in the budget. 1, tax revenue decisions, as Carl said. 2, we might well see some of the benefit cuts announced in the budget. We'll see. We will almost certainly see in-year departmental cuts. So the Chancellor has talked about, government has talked about getting ahead of the game and actually making some further cuts in 2015-16 inside departmental budgets. And the other thing that we'll see that's crucial for the whole process is the departmental spending envelope. How much money is there to split up among departments in total? There's a little bit of a question as to how far the government will take that forward. Likely, I think, to be a 3-year envelope they set. Probably they won't want to put in that final upward swing of the public spending because they won't want to encourage departments to be bidding for that extra bit of money at the end. They'll probably want to do that later in the Parliament, but we shall see. Second big fiscal event, one that people often forget about, party conference takes place. We don't have a coalition, so there's only one party conference that matters to us as a fiscal event this time round. But I'd be fairly surprised if we don't see something eye-catching in that party conference, and actually probably something else eye-catching as well. But just to say, it's not necessarily clear. We've got quite used to the run into election, eye-catching equals extra spending commitment. Remember in 2010 at the Conservative Party conference, it was the cuts to child benefit for higher rate taxpayers, or the elimination of child benefit for higher rate taxpayers, that was announced at the party conference to do with the wider political narrative. So I'm sure there'll be something eye-catching, but it's not quite clear that it's going to be a giveaway. And the final thing, we know the spending review will take place in the autumn. Precise date hasn't been fixed, but October was last time round. 2 things we might see in that. Further benefit cuts, quite possibly if they can't do the full set in the budget, and they might well want to hold off some of those cuts because they may well want a narrative of cutting these benefits, but it saves us from cutting spending further in these other areas. And secondly, departmental totals going forward over whatever time period we've got. And we can be pretty certain, as I said earlier, the Treasury can do spreadsheets. I'd be pretty much certain that the numbers in those departmental totals will add up to the type of deficit reduction the Chancellor has pledged himself to in the Manifesto. Now, of course, these are the final announcements. But the spending review is actually, it's really a political exercise, not a technical exercise. Technical exercise will kick off. Political exercise started quite a while ago. Arguably, Simon Stevens, Chief Executive of the NHS, put out the NHS Plan last year. And I think it's safe to say that Simon Stevens had quite a good spending review, because during the election he got his settlement of the 8 billion real terms that he'd been asking for. Setting those numbers is only part of the equation, though. And it's actually quite useful to think about, well, how do you get the implementable plans that are really going to join up the numbers we're going to talk about in the spending review and the reality people are experiencing on the ground, and therefore the political sustainability of what we're talking about. Key to this is going to be the generation of efficiencies. This is a key element of what we need to do over the next period. And a lot of that will lie inside public service spend. So let's have a look at the NHS Plan, the bit of the spending review that's already been completed on the political side. I'll take you through some of the components that built up the NHS Plan that Simon Stevens got his £8 billion figure out of. If you take the actual costs of running, this is NHS England, in 2013-14, 94 billion is what's the number in the plan. There was an estimate in the plan of the cost pressures that the NHS would face over the coming years. This is things like the demographic change that we all know is coming towards us. It's also changes in service treatments, with new treatments coming online, the cost of those, which have historically been much greater. 43 billion was the number inside this. And you can be pretty certain that Simon Stevens will actually want to see if he can reduce those pressures on the NHS. I think many of us caught him yesterday, I think it was, talking about the need to regulate the food industry, to tackle obesity. And it kind of brings home to you that those cost pressures, some of them are controllable inside the NHS, but many of them require actions that go well beyond the people working in the NHS. Indeed, they also include the Prime Minister. I'm pretty certain that a 7-day NHS was not in the cost pressures that were in the NHS plan last year. We shall see what else gets factored in as we go forward towards the end of the spending review. Overall cost pressures, if you add that up, you've got 137 billion was the amount the NHS plan says was needed to cover the pressures by 2020-2021. That wasn't, of course, the end of the story. That wasn't the spending bid that Simon Stevens put in. £22 billion of productivity gains were factored into the plan. Now, if you look at this, this is effectively, it's kind of a technical argument. It's basically saying, well, look, can the NHS achieve the type of productivity gains that we see not so much inside the public sector historically, but in the wider economy, around 2% a year. And actually, Simon Stevens, a little bit of a Simon Says moment, well, maybe we can achieve a little bit more than that, let's say 2 to 3%, and you got that £22 billion number. Of course, those sort of modelling exercises, they're quite interesting, but the reality of how you achieve these productivity gains is actually about people working on the ground and how our system actually acts. I mean, obvious examples that come out from the winter we've just been through, if you're looking at hospitals, how are we going to be able to discharge people who are medically ready to be discharged but need to go into social care? And again, emphasising it's not just about the NHS that we realise those productivity gains, it's about the join-ups in the wider system. So those huge tasks to do, and not based on historic what we've achieved before necessarily. Some of this is about ratcheting up what we need to do. £8 billion, the number that drove the election campaign, is there. You'll notice it's the smallest number on this graph. The 108 billion was the assumption of flat real that the NHS was assuming was already politically committed to it in this. So that right-hand side, basically the spending review, the bit that's done. The tricky bits, where do you get the productivity gains? Can you reduce some of those cost pressures? Still to do, and still, to a large extent, to be planned. I touched on it a bit. Joining up services locally. Whitehall has a terrible tendency to think that sitting in a room in Whitehall and drawing up wonderful plans gives you things which are implementable. Actually, it has to be said that's probably an SW1 and think tank issue as well. I have done it myself in the past. Actually, everything we're talking about here is about literally millions of people working in different ways. It's about wage control within that. It's about how the redundancies are going to play out, and can you keep the capability in your organisation as people are moving out of it. Those require, and it's the join-ups across those require things to be actually happening on the ground. Now, many people in this room will have been around one of the key unlockers of that, localism, devolving power, decentralising power within England, allowing decisions to be made closer to the ground, and critically decisions which cut across the silos we created in our system. We've been around that conversation many, many times. The Institute, we put something out about a year or so ago, which looked at, well, we talk about it a lot, but it never really happens. What are the blockages that stop us decentralising power fundamentally in the UK? And there's quite a lot of them. I've put up some here. Central government blockages, local government blockages, political ones particularly, but the public not being particularly interested quite often in the types of changes that are moved on the political side. Really interesting to think whether some of these things are fundamentally changing. Some of these blockages are being overcome. Departments don't give up power as easily. Well, the Treasury is now leading the charge in decentralisation. So maybe that blockage is a bit easier to overcome than it was previously, certainly within the spending review. We're looking at geographic scales which really make sense, unlike some of the devolution, decentralisation agenda back in 2010. And elected mayors create a political barrier to just reversing those. So maybe a few more of those blockages may be overcomable. And if we see a spending review, which is not just sending powers down, but giving real control over budgets to local areas, maybe some of those public things that will only support things that really make a difference. And that status quo bias, because the status quo bias may have changed a little with the debates around Scotland that have been going on. So maybe some of those blockers disappear. It's not that everything's gone, but there's a real chance that we may see a change, a fundamental change in our ability to decentralise power, and therefore get real power slightly close to where it needs to be if we're going to realise the efficiencies that we're kind of going to be talking about as we go forward. Final thing I want to touch on, strengthening Whitehall. Whitehall itself saw some very large cuts in its scale and size. On average, departments down around 20% in terms of headcount over the last period. I doubt it's going to be particularly different. I can't quite see Whitehall being one of the most protected areas of the public sector over the next few years. But that's not really the issue that Whitehall has. We're going to have a set of spending plans, possibly different ways of governing if we really decentralise power. What are the skills and capabilities Whitehall needs to implement the spending review? And this is a fundamental part of the review planning. Last time around 2010, we left that to sort of as an afterthought. Let's cut the numbers and then figure out what we need. This time round, there's a reasonable possibility that it'll be much more integrated. If you look at what Nicholas Macpherson, the Permanent Secretary of Treasury, is talking about increasing the financial capability of Whitehall. Can we get people into the Treasury, indeed the rest of Whitehall, who are capable of developing real implementation plans with sensible financial numbers inside them, not just doing spreadsheets that add up but don't actually connect to real plans? If you look at what the Cabinet Secretary is committed to, and indeed bringing in new Chief Executive for the Civil Service, John Manzoni, very clear drive to sort out problems which have been around for a very long time. Can we improve the commercial capability of Whitehall? Can we get people in who can actually run major projects and sustainably do that? We've talked about these weaknesses for about 50 years. And on the political side, a very real join between the Treasury and Cabinet Office. Matt Hancock is the new Minister for the Cabinet Office, very closely politically aligned with the Chancellor. A real chance of the centre of Whitehall actually working to strengthen the whole capability of Whitehall. We'll see. That may all turn out to be pie in the sky and we go back to our old ways of doing things, but there's a real chance now that that will happen. Okay, I've talked a little bit about how we get implementable plans. Final thing I wanted to touch on, political sustainability of the reforms that, we're going to have to implement. Will the cuts be seen, 3 elements to this, will the cuts be seen as necessary? The government will almost certainly want to see what happened in the last Parliament happen again. If you look at this as polling running from 2011 to 2015, it shows that if you ask people whether they think the cuts were necessary or unnecessary, pretty consistently across the whole of the Parliament, it doesn't really drop off as we move forward. Twice as many people are saying they think the cuts are necessary than think they are unnecessary. It'll be interesting to see. The political rhetoric has changed a bit. We have a third party in Parliament now which is avowedly anti-austerity, very different to what we had before. So there's a political voice there for that, but you know, it hasn't really affected the public at all in a measurable way. Are the cuts seen as fair? And you have to be careful what the word fair here means. This is much more nuanced than necessarily just the decile graphs that we're often used to about how income moves. This is a much more talking to people, it's concepts of fairness. Does this make sense to them? Do the arguments really stack up in terms of the type of trade-offs they themselves would want to make? Very different pattern on this if we bring up the polling. The proportion of people saying cuts are being done fairly or unfairly, about 2 to 1 people saying they're being done unfairly compared with fairly. And actually, if you look at that, this argument was lost very early on by the government. You can see that it actually started out relatively close, but it split within the first year. And if you look in more detail at that, the actual fiscal announcements were actually quite positive. Most of the bumps up in people saying it's going to be done fairly were actually around the budget. They were around the party conference when they did the child benefit changes. They were actually a small bump around the actual spending review announcement itself. It's as people got used to, well, what did this really mean, that you see that decline, those sharp declines in the people who thought it was being done fairly. Things like building schools for the future, a policy announcement which said we are going to stop repairing schools because we're procuring this stuff in a really bad way, we're just wasting money over it. That's a very good technical argument, but it's a completely useless argument for political sustainability and fairness, because the initial reaction is, why you're saying you can't procure things properly, therefore my kids have to go to a school that's not good enough. That doesn't stack up. You've lost that argument before you started. People like Sweden made arguments which were much more about we can cut the benefits that we're giving to children, but we have to do it to protect the education they're receiving. We protect the teachers inside the schools because you have one shot at education, you can sort out your income later in life. Those sort of arguments, they may not work for everybody, but they're much more plausible political arguments. So something about how you construct the arguments and how you balance things is really important. Final point, missing markets. In 2010, quite a bit of what we were talking about was about the pressure that would come from the markets on the UK to actually make the reforms it needed to do to get back into a good fiscal position. Jill said we weren't marking our own homework. I think we, along with everyone else, were wrong about that. We certainly would not have predicted that over the period, record low interest rates were what the UK was going to face in terms of its borrowing. It's quite a big issue for political sustainability. It is a lot easier to make arguments for the necessity of things if there is a clear and credible external threat that says you have to do this. If that threat, the OECD yesterday, on the front page of the FT today, basically saying, oh, you can go a bit slower because you can, the markets will let you, that's not necessarily helpful if you're thinking about the political messaging around this. It may be very helpful if you're thinking about how you want to borrow. Right, just to draw that together, quick conclusion. Major tasks ahead. I think I share that view with Carl. Setting the departmental budgets, though, is the relatively easy task. It's a political task. It's not going to be straightforward. Carl's taking you through some of the trade-offs that people have to make, particularly on the benefits side. But actually getting implementable changes much more difficult. Changes that can actually be made on the ground and changes which are going to command political sustainability, are going to be politically sustainable. I mentioned at the start Canada and the fact that after the 84 election, they didn't succeed. They had to come back in 88. I suspect some people in this room will know that in 88, it didn't go all that well either. By the middle of the Parliament, there were record concerns about the deficit being expressed in the public opinion polls. They had very large public sector strikes as a result. They failed to sort out their fiscal position. It was after the third election in the early 1990s that they actually sorted out their fiscal position. So, on that cheery note, that we might all be back here again in 2020 with the same sort of issues, but let's hope not. I'll hand back to Jill.
Okay, thank you very much, Julian. And so let's go straight into question and answer. If you could be quite brief, so we can take as many as possible. We're going to do it one at a time. Say if your question's particularly directed at Carl and Julian, tell us who you are, and there are roving mics, so if anyone would like to go, let's go right just in the corner there. You're the closest to the mic. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Oscar Williamson. I'm from the Treasury. I suppose my question is more for Carl. What do you think the chances that we'll have a kind of upside surprise on the growth side, which would kind of make this all much easier?
Okay. Now, the fact that someone from the Treasury's gone first is, I'm just going to remind you, this is being live streamed, oh civil servants, so do watch what you say. But I'm sure the Chancellor will be very happy with that question. So, are you just too gloomy, Carl? Upside surprise.
Well, in terms of the deficit, the OBR has produced a forecast which it thinks is a central estimate. We know the forecast will be wrong because every forecast is. But it thinks there's an equal chance of upside surprise or downside surprise. And we've had significant downside surprises for many, 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 many years in a row. So touch wood, we'll start to get some upside surprises. I guess, but the manifesto does commit to total public spending being cut by 1% a year for 2 years and then being frozen for 1 year. So in some sense, it would make the social security budget a bit easier to manage. It would make the debt interest down, but it won't help the setting of DELs this autumn because those upside surprises presumably were more likely to come later and perhaps give the Chancellor money to play with if he wanted to top up some spending plans at some subsequent date. So maybe, hopefully we will get an upside surprise. I don't think it's not likely to be a big one between now and say the spending review that would mean that you could have softer DELs than what I was talking about, but what it could mean is that some budget in, say, 2017 or 2018, the Chancellor is able to say, well, actually, I'm overachieving my deficit forecast, I'm going to eliminate it easily, I can spray a bit of money around, top up some of those services that are particularly struggling. I think it's probably that scenario might be the one that we can hope for.
Just one quick point on that. If you look at a lot of the international ones where people get out of the type of hole we're in, when it eventually happens, it usually is because there is a big upside surprise. There's big growth in the economies around them. So it may not be, if we do sort this out, it may well be because we have something like that, rather than just hoping it comes along.
So Canada surfaces the dot-com boom in the US. Yeah, David. Yep.
David Walker, I used to work for the Audit Commission, which prompts me to ask Julian, where is the evidence that devolution secures the large efficiency savings you implied, particularly in a context where there will be no fiscal devolution on the tax raising side? The government's made it perfectly clear it doesn't want local authorities to have financial autonomy when it comes to raising money, and indeed it wants them to be even more restrictive about raising finance locally than previously.
Okay, Julian?
I think if you look at this, the type of efficiency changes that we've had, and you look at internationally consolidations that are going on and have achieved efficiency savings inside themselves, you virtually never find some grand plan drawn up at the centre of government. Now, the easiest ones that you get are where there's a very centralised organisation, the management of that organisation, tax systems are classic examples, where that management seizes the opportunity to drive through efficiency changes that is long planned. If you're into the more complex world of actually joining up across services, where, you know, if you talk to anybody in this sort of public services at the moment, they'll tell you the really big savings are no longer inside those silos, inside those organisations. They're across those organisations. They're making them work differently. It's not so much that decentralisation in and of itself will automatically produce glorious efficiency savings for us. It's how you're going to go about it. How are you going to build the structures that really create the potential for the people leading those services to realise the plans that they will already be able to generate. And at the moment, our system just gets in the way of doing that. Now, you talk about taxes as well inside that. I think for the very particular things we're looking at on efficiency, it's slightly different to that wider decentralisation argument. Will you see real and true local democracy? And some of the things that are likely to play out in the Scotland debate about these things. Will Scotland really raise taxes if it wants to have a different type of fiscal settlement to the rest of the UK? That's not something that I'm sure we're going to sort this time, but there is real potential in somewhere like Manchester to actually get the right geography, the right services in line, and potentially the right leadership at a local level that will make a difference that just cannot be done from DH talking to the different parts of central government.
So, Carl, one of the ways of sort of reducing some of the pressure on local government might be to look at taxes. We've had a council tax freeze de facto since 2010. The government's now reviewing business rates. What do you see as the prospects for the local burden of taxation?
So, the government could choose to allow councils to increase council tax more quickly than it has done in the past, but it won't help it if it's serious about keeping to the spending settlement, because that involves more spending. I guess the other thing councils have done to date within their freedoms is to increase user charges for services, which is often scored as a reduction in the net spend on a service, so you subsidise something by less. We might see more of that if there's more scope for charges in some areas.
Yeah. Okay, remember, if you're in the other room and want to come in and ask a question, do come in. Let's go. Let's take the mics over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Robert Cook, National Audit Office. I'm really interested to know whether you think the government can get out of some of these difficult decisions if it had a programme of asset sales right through the Parliament. For example, I understand that if the student loan book was sold off, it would automatically improve public sector net debt, regardless of whether they've got the same value as it's accounted for in the accounts.
Okay, so Carl, is asset sales potential easing this?
No, because the government's not looking to cut investment spending. The figures I've just talked about have all been for total public spending. I should stress within that, they're not looking to cut investment at all. Asset sales would be a reduction in net investment. What they're looking to do is cut day-to-day spending in order to get the current budget deficit down and then to get the deficit down by more. So it's all about reducing day-to-day spending of government. Asset sales would not help in that objective.
So Julian, I think it's quite an interesting question there. Are there other places the government can go that, you know, maybe aren't in Carl's fantastic charts, where actually there is the potential to raise money to reduce the deficit, if not necessarily to cut spending?
Well, I think one of the things that we've been sort of thinking about is around the, if you look at things like tax expenditures, the parts of our tax system that actually are effectively doing things which are very, very similar to spending. We talked about the processes we went through there. Spending will be covered in the spending review. The budget process will think about tax revenues. There's actually no formal process in government that goes to the tax expenditures we've got in the system and says, are they really achieving what we said they were going to achieve? And are they the best way of achieving this compared to spending? And the fact that we've never really done that process might suggest to you that you might want to start looking there. Spending review, the NAO and the PAC, I think the Public Accounts Committee have now said they think that those should be considered in the spending review alongside spending those areas. Seems a very sensible suggestion to us.
Okay, that's one possibility the Treasury could look at. Yeah.
Hi there, Julia Goldsworthy, former Special Advisor at the Treasury. I'm surprised that neither of you really talked about a big political challenge to implementation, which is the fact that this government has a majority of 12, and a lot of the cuts, particularly in welfare, will involve primary legislation. So, isn't that another big barrier to actually delivering the number? And on an administration point of view, Whitehall needs to be strengthened, but you talked about some quite big numbers in terms of headcount reductions. What does that, is Whitehall keeping the right people to have the capability to deliver these kind of reforms?
I think those points from Julia both speak directly to your presentation.
Yeah. I think the way you implement things is actually one of the things that you've got to think your way through. I mean, welfare reform classically, and indeed tax rises, the legislative stage is a very difficult one. And historically, certainly, it's been, you've lost a lot of your savings as you put them through Parliament because you've had to make concessions as it had become clear exactly which groups are hit. And I think that balance will be something to watch. So we might start out with 12 billion, but whether we get 12 billion legislated is one part of the implementation issue. The second is obviously the political sustainability, because this will involve people really receiving less money than they have in the past. Quite often we've just cut new claimants what they're going to receive, and that's much easier to do. I think the other big questions, wage restraint, Carl touched on it. We do quite centralised negotiations on public sector wages. Probably will be able to do that, but the nominal baseline here is really, really tight for us. So again, it's back to redundancy schemes. I think the public sector as a whole, and certainly Whitehall in particular, know a hell of a lot more than they did in 2010 about running good redundancy schemes in departments. That focus on who do you need to keep is the much more important question than how do you make it easy, get moving people out. And there's all kinds of reasons why that's true, as well as for the people themselves. But I'm hopeful that Whitehall will be asking itself that question much more and thinking about its total wage bill. Do we need to bring in people who actually are experts in particular areas? We need these skills in, and that might force us to make other changes that would be much more difficult if you were starting with let's just protect jobs, is your first question.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Molly, come down here to the front and then we'll go there. Yeah. Just wait for the mic. And Lauren, if you want to move the mic over.
Thank you. Peter Kane. One of the key drivers of longer-term fiscal sustainability is probably the underlying trend growth rate and productivity. And yet the recent record on productivity isn't great, and it didn't feature in either of your presentations, which is perhaps surprising if we think about growing tax revenues and spend and all the rest of it. Can you explain a little bit more of why it didn't feature in your presentations and what should be done about it?
Okay, Carl, do you want to kick off with that?
Yeah, so it's certainly true that an upside surprise on productivity growth relative to the OBR's forecast would be something that could really make a huge difference. All the numbers I presented were basically assuming the March 2015 budget forecasts were right, which had similar levels of austerity to what the Conservative Party manifesto is pledging. So, as a baseline, it seems pretty sensible, but clearly there is uncertainty. But equally, things could turn out a lot better than we expect. They could also turn out worse than we expect, as they did in the last Parliament. So it's not all in one direction.
Julian?
I think on the spending review, one of the things that was really actually noticeably absent, had to be worked back in over the couple of years after the 2010 spending review, was a narrative about what would we protect if we wanted to stimulate growth and productivity in the UK. Now, I expect actually that will be much more prominent this time round, because the Chancellor will simply want to be able to say that actually what I've done has protected our long-run future. But some of the trades are very, very difficult, so how much you'll be able to make that real and truly protect areas that he thinks are really important for boosting productivity in the UK. It's going to be an interesting question. And of course, we did touch on productivity. Public service productivity is a key part of making all this happen. Probably the most important part if you think you're actually going to hit these spending totals regardless of what happens in the economy, which I suspect the Chancellor probably will choose to do if he can manage it.
Okay, could you move the mic just behind you? Yep.
Chris Giles from the Financial Times. Yesterday, the Treasury was extremely resistant to the notion from the OECD that you might want to smooth out the spending cuts over the 5 years rather than concentrate them in the 3 years. Is this just a negotiating tactic by the Treasury because the first thing it can't do in the spending review is make a concession?
Okay. Carl, do you want to comment on that end of the roller coaster?
So, We were always going to increase public spending in real terms at some point. So it seems to me we were going to cut for a period to get the deficit down under the Conservatives, and at some point they were going to start increasing it in real terms. So the fact we have that profile is not so surprising. It's just a question of when do you start increasing it in real terms. And is it surprising that they haven't moved? Well, if they want to keep to the Conservative Party manifesto, then they can't. It says 1% real terms cut for 2 years, followed by a real freeze for 1 year. And it says we'll eliminate the deficit by 2018-19. So those commitments were written down only a month or so ago. So it would be a pretty quick turnaround.
I think it is absolutely certain that the Treasury at no point in this process will want to give any of the fundamental building blocks of it right up to the very end. If they give ground now, they might as well abandon the whole thing, and they're very well aware of that. I think we can expect some robust negotiating, but within the rules that the Treasury is going to set.
So that goes to this issue of the timing, doesn't it? Because you both said you thought this sort of, OBR roller coaster meant that we were heading for a 3-year spending review rather than a 5-year spending review. I just wondered whether you actually thought that was the right thing to do, or whether we shouldn't just have a spending review that covered the whole Parliament.
So the Chancellor and Prime Minister have actually been talking a lot about 17-18, the 2 years, and that's when the social security cuts have to be delivered by. The 12 billion commitment is for 17-18, so we could see a 2-year spending review. In some sense, I think 3 years would make more sense because it's 18-19 where the cuts end under the current plan, and that's the year in which the deficit target relates to. I think it would be pretty odd to have it going for longer for total spending, just because it seems weird to have you've got cuts for some years, then you've got increases mixed into the same review. That said, I think you might want to make different settlements for different departments in terms of the duration. If we know what the aid budget's going to be for the next 5 years, why not just set it now and let them get on with it? Similarly, maybe we just set the NHS, we set schools, and maybe it's other departments get a 3-year spending review, whereas those ones get a 5-year one.
Yeah, I think Carl's exactly right on this. We have an obsession with the formal rules of the spending review and pretending that we're setting everything within those. Obviously, things like capital spend are pre-committed on much longer timescales. It makes sense to have a spending review for the plans anyway that underlie the fiscal numbers. For some of the changes we're talking about here, 3 to 5 years is the timeline if you're trying to really drive efficiencies and effectiveness in any kind of service. Having plans that cover that is really vital. Whether the formal numbers are fixed in the formal spreadsheets of the Treasury is kind of something that I think you can sort out the gap between those two.
Okay, let's come over here. Yep, there. Yep.
Ben Chu from The Independent. Question for Carl. It's a slightly backwards-looking question, but I think not an unimportant one given what you've outlined further. You say that the way the Conservatives describe departmental cuts in their manifesto of 13 billion as being misleading. I wonder if one could follow on from that and say that people who voted Conservative were actually misled? Or do you think in the general election campaign all these issues were thoroughly thrashed out and everyone had a very clear impression of what a Conservative administration would do?
We were all stunned by the quality of public debate on spending in the election campaign. Can't.
In terms of the main parties' manifestos, I don't think any of them was complete. So I don't think anyone who was voting in the election on the grounds of what the public spending plans of the Conservatives or Labour or Liberal Democrats were had a full impression of that. But I certainly think that the description of, we'll just take 1% out for 2 years, certainly risked misleading people about what that would feel like.
I think there's also a very interesting question that runs forward from this. Election campaigns, you look internationally at this, people do not talk about the specifics of what they're going to do when they're in this situation. It just does not happen. We saw in this election campaign what was utterly predictable. We asked the questions, but you don't get an answer to them. The question is, have you pushed it too far in your political sustainability? Have you got a narrative where when you start to unveil the things that you do, that won't make you regret some of the things you said? And the obvious one is, of course, tuition fees from the last election. And if we're in a situation where it truly turns out that we're in a tuition fees scenario, and who knows, then it's going to be extremely sticky for any government taking stuff forward. If it's just, actually, we all know, and it's quite reasonable, we've been talking about cuts going on for a very long time. It's quite possible, those necessary figures didn't move. The public fully appreciates what was actually going to come, and is not going to be that surprised by it.
Okay, let's go on.
Martin Wheatley, Govern Up, among other things. A question for Julian. I think you're absolutely right to highlight the Manchester announcement and things and their significance for a rather different kind of commitment to localism from what we've seen in the past. The question is really about processes, political and bureaucratic, in Whitehall. One is, if we've got a spreading geography of places that the government is devolving budgets to significantly, Whitehall is going to have to get better at thinking about places as opposed to programmes, which is what the Treasury spreadsheets have exclusively dealt with in the past. And secondly, where it has done something different in terms of geography in the devolved and now the devolved countries, it's had Barnet as a very expensive way of not having to think about it. But if it's thinking spatially in England in a different way, does it have to start getting back to thinking about Barnet?
Well, I'll take the first go. I might leave Barnet. I'll touch on Barnet, but I might leave the total of that to Carl. On thinking about places, yes, Whitehall has to operate in a very different way if we're truly decentralising power. There is much more common in many, many political systems where the centre negotiates a lot with where the real service delivery is taking place in provinces, in state level, things like that. And that will call for a different set of skills and a different way of approaching things. I think actually the devolution settlements are playing now even more strongly in the UK because the politics is now so firmly entrenched in the House of Commons. The degree to which the differences in how we are running something like a national health service across the UK is playing out more and more and forcing officials to really think through the consequences in a way that maybe 5-10 years ago we'll just do a solution for England and I'm sure the devolves will just take it up themselves, starts to become a little less common. The final thing, just on, it's not so much Barnet and those big level things that I think is important. How do you diffuse, if you're going to see Manchester actually make the types of efficiency savings that we want to see? Yes, there are questions about how you do the budgets and share that out around the rest of the country. The bigger one is how do you diffuse that knowledge and way of doing things to other parts of the country, which we've been historically very weak at. So what are we going to do about that, and what role does Whitehall, if any, have in that? What do professional networks play in that?
It's quite interesting whether we expect to see as sort of, whether it's a Hans formula, so another chief secretary goes down in history as a person who gives his name to something that lives on long after he does, whatever. I mean, do we expect to see a formula settlement for Manchester?
No. I very much doubt it.
Okay, well, future of Barnet then. Barnet, bit of Barnety, Carl.
Well, in terms of what Scotland can expect, the numbers suggest that there will be cuts to the grant from central government to Scotland. How big they will be will depend on the actual spending review allocation, how it's split between things that are Barneted and not. But the cuts look like they will be less than the 6.6% average cut. And clearly the main parties have committed to keeping Barnet. Scotland will then have to make decisions on how it delivers those cuts or whether it softens them with some tax rises.
And we, of course, have the Welsh wanting it looked at again. And there's still some negotiations, aren't there, about some of the block grant, some of the adjustments for some of the tax devolution.
There's a lot of detail to be sorted out exactly how, if Scotland changes its tax system, how that affects, or indeed if England changes its tax system, how that affects the amount of grants Scotland gets. And those details really do matter. And we've done some work, a colleague at IFS previously, looking at how the devolution of business rates operated, and essentially that formula was done in a rather odd way, which looks like it was overly generous to Scotland by quite a significant degree. So getting the detail right of if England or if Scotland changes the tax system, how should we adjust the grant that we pay Scotland is very important.
John Geeve, you didn't talk about changing the boundary of the public sector, i.e. what the private sector pays for and what government pays for. But looking at the sort of numbers you're talking about, is there any scope for shifting the boundary? I mean, I suppose we've seen a little bit this last 5 years in legal services, for example, a change in that boundary, a little bit in higher education. Is there more to come, or is that just completely taboo to start talking about social care, health, schooling, mainstream education?
So, Carl, you raised a bit about user charges as one of the potential safety valves in this. What about John's question about?
So certainly local government has made more use of charges. In the last Parliament we also tried to cut spending by charging for tuition, but haven't saved anything like what we would have hoped through that. There may be more scope in some areas. I know, though, if you talk about charging in the NHS for things that we don't currently charge for, People get very upset about that suggestion, despite the fact we already charge for some things, like my dentistry and optician's appointments, so it's not all free. But there seems to be a lot of resistance to any increase in charging for things that are currently free in that sphere. Of course, in some areas of government, if the public sector just stops doing things, the private sector will start to fill that space to some extent. So that's another way in which you will deliver a charging environment through the private sector.
Yeah. I think, I'm sure people will be looking at those charging options. There are obvious routes to go down. As Carl says, the political salience of them is quite high. But I think there's a bigger issue here that you're touching on. If you look at, and we're constantly concentrating on how do we deal with the deficit in our conversations. If we hadn't had that, we'd be having a different fiscal pressure conversation, which is, we have very big things like the state pension and the NHS sitting inside a constrained share because we don't want to raise taxes of public spend, and it's pushing very, very far inside that. I don't think we're anywhere near the debate that we will probably have to have about how sustainable that is a long-run model of running our public finances. For the minute, I think we're going to have very much the debate that was set out in the election going forward, and a few changes to charging around the edges where people see that they think that's politically salient at this moment in time.
Anything you want to put on the table, John? Okay, John.
Jonathan Portis from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Going back to the 12 billion welfare cuts, in the last Parliament, the government did try to reform quite big bits of the system, in particular ESA and disability living allowance, and scored £5 billion worth of savings per year or so, none of which in practice materialised because reforms either failed or, in the case of DLA, haven't yet been implemented. Given that, how do you think the Treasury is likely to approach the considerably more difficult task of saving 12 billion within 2 years? And in particular, Carl, how do you think they're going to square this circle? Because the Treasury does worry quite a lot about work incentives for low-income families, and it's very difficult to see how you take that sort of money out of the main targets on particular tax credits without having a significant negative impact on work incentives for precisely the sort of people who've been, one of the big success stories of the last Parliament has been the number of low-income people, the number of low-paid jobs that have been created.
Right. So taking £12 billion out of over 2 years is clearly going to be very, very difficult. The timescale is challenging as much as the total. It seems to exclude reforms of the type of let's test people's health and see if we really want to give them this benefit, or let's see if we can do something to encourage them back into the labour market. There doesn't seem to be time to do too much of that. Of course, if you're cutting benefits on average, you may well be improving work incentives because you're making the incomes that people would get for being out of work lower. But it's the natural trade-off that we always face in policy making in this area. Do you want to spend, if you want to spend less money, do you want to mess up work incentives, or do you want to make the poorest people poorer? That's the trade-off they will face, and there's no way around that, regardless of the, that's implicit in every budget decision on this area. And I guess what we'll see in July or in the autumn is exactly how the government makes that trade-off. Is it taking benefits away from people in work, middle-income people, or is it taking it away from those out of work on the lowest incomes, which would strengthen work incentives?
I think Jonathan's touching, some of the stuff you have to think about in these areas is which types of risk do you really want to run? So Julia was asking a question about the legislative risk, which is the quick change of rate in the benefit cut people's pay. Obviously from the last Parliament, we saw something we probably knew already. It's very, very difficult to do IT-driven reform to systems that are going to change and cut out cost. So what risks are you taking? But I actually think we'll probably end up taking both sets this time round. There's a lot of talk about digital government and how do you implement digitisation across wider public services. The two big obvious ones where that matters for central government are the running of the benefit system and the running of the tax system. We've got very large workforces in both those departments, HMRC and in DWP. I'd expect to see a government looking fairly carefully at how much it can use new technology to allow it to run services better and also reduce its workforce cost. out of that. But we also know that's going to be an extremely risky thing to do over a time period. So the real question is not so much, does this sound good? Let's digitise everything, technology is going to help us out. The real question is actually, do you have the governance and assurance in place that will let you know whether you've got something that's really working or whether you've got something that looks a little akin to universal credit, shall we say, which ran for about 2 to 3.5 years with people saying it was going really well when most people were quite aware that it wasn't, and that's something we can't really afford to repeat, certainly not in any of the timescales Carl's talking about.
Okay, more questions? Yes, at the back.
Hello, Anthony Rubin from BBC News. When we did this in 2010, we all got our sums wrong because we missed the way that austerity and changes to the tax system would clobber growth and tax revenue. Are we making the same mistake again?
Carl.
Well, as I said, all the forecasts will be wrong. All the numbers in my presentation will be wrong. So sorry about that. All we're doing here really is assuming that the OBR's March forecast is right or is a central one, 50-50, whether things were better or worse than that. That had about as much austerity as what the Conservatives are planning. So it's not like they're planning something significantly different, and therefore you'd expect a significant difference in the outlook for growth given what the Conservatives want to do compared to what the coalition budget planned back in March.
So, Carl, one of the things that the government and indeed other parties used quite heroically in the election campaign to make the numbers add up were these tax avoidance, 5 billion from unspecified measures or whatever. What's the track record in actually converting tax avoidance into taxes actually received?
Well, so the Conservative Manifesto has, I think it was £4 billion net tax cut from things they actually specified, and then a £5 billion takeaway from avoidance, which they didn't specify. The Lib Dems and Labour had bigger sums for tax avoidance. That's clearly risky because we can be pretty certain that increasing the personal allowance, for example, is going to cost a lot of money, and we can be fairly certain how much money that will cost. I can't cost a tax avoidance measure when I've got no detail on it whatsoever. Historically, it's very, very hard to say how successful we've been. Often it's difficult to see where the revenues would appear. If you do some tax avoidance thing on, say, capital gains tax, maybe that shores up your income tax revenue. So it's quite a difficult question to answer. And it's clearly, there is a risk in trying to kind of bank certain tax cuts paid for by uncertain tax rises.
I think there's actually one of the structural things that we've got different from 2010 is we've now got the OBR up and running. And it has actually been an incredibly successful innovation. As Carl says, none of its numbers have ever been right, but then Robert Choate would say that himself. It's about the process and what we look at. And if you look at what the OBR is doing in certain areas, what happens as a result of the revenues you claim, we started to say how risky are the different sets of revenues. I spent some of my career inside the Treasury doing tax avoidance things against corporate tax stuff. Those numbers are very, very risky. There's a lot of uncertainty as to how much you're going to get in. Quite often the spending that appears in the Treasury scorecard, which we're going to do, is pretty certain. We're giving the money away. So we add an extra risk through tax avoidance measures into budgets. There's also something that's missing, which I hope the OBR will look at. Quite often you are only allowed to count the extra revenue you're getting from a tax avoidance measure because you can convince people that we'd lost the revenue somewhere else against the previous forecast of what we were going to get in. That number doesn't appear in the public finances, the money we'd actually lost, which we're just getting back. So if you just sum up as we're tending to happen, the anti-avoidance measures we've put in through the budget scorecards, it looks like we've raised huge amounts of money through anti-avoidance. What we've mainly been doing is closing a series of gates while people open other gates, which we're going to close later. So I think there's a real challenge as to whether you think tax avoidance is really that route way to get you the types of revenues in that you're going to actually need for very real spending commitments or tax cut commitments elsewhere.
And I think actually during the NEO report you mentioned earlier has some quite horrific figures on the difference between the outturn on the costs of some tax measures and actually the initial HMRC Treasury forecast that went in. You can see if our Treasury friend's still here. So I think that's quite an interesting place to go and look at. Any more questions before we wind it up? None from the other room? Yes, one more here. Yeah, another couple. So yeah, and then there. Yes.
Dahlia Fleming, Camden Council. Earlier you mentioned some possibilities of how they could do the 12 billion cuts in terms of welfare, which included raising child poverty and also possibly, well, you would assume unintended consequences of homelessness and other repercussions of when you cut welfare. Is there any work being done, or do you have any suggestions on how the government could avoid that? Because obviously they have their own targets in terms of child poverty, and you would assume to try and prevent homelessness and other kind of high levels of deprivation.
Okay, so for the housing benefit cuts in the private sector that the coalition government did, there was an evaluation commission by DWP, which IFS was part of. There we found only relatively few people moved home as a result of that policy. We also found that it was relatively, most of the incidence was also on the tenant. It wasn't the case that rents were being driven down, which is what the coalition might have hoped for. But there wasn't big evidence of lots and lots of people, for example, having to move long distances. That seemed to be really, really a minority thing, and it was really people staying in the same house, paying roughly the same rent, and just getting less housing benefit for it.
Just on some of those, I'm going to give a slightly prosaic answer. I'm not going to touch on the actual social things, but one of the things that we know we are weak at is joining up the consequences of reductions in one area with the effects in others. We do far too much of our planning inside departmental silos, and actually within that, within the policy programs within those. One of the innovations that is going on, which we actually here at the Institute think is very powerful and positive, is the Treasury has started to take seriously what does it mean to have a government finance profession looking across the whole of Whitehall and thinking about changes not just from the economist's view, but the fundamental, what you would find if you were in business, the management accountant view. How do you link up what you change in your inputs, what happens to your outputs, what happens to the spillovers, what happens to the risk? How do you build models which take that into account, which allow you better forecasts of what's going to happen? Still at very early days, but the types of issues that we pick up here, where do the extra cost pressures come from if you push down on one side? Do they come out elsewhere? Are really the types of things we need to have better grip on. We're not going to have them for October or November this year, but certainly in a few years' time, I would hope the Treasury will make a significant difference to that.
Yes.
David Middleton. We've been talking about demographics and how that puts pressure on the NHS. I'm a little nervous about this 5-year horizon for spending plans, because it seems to me one of the low-hanging fruits available to the government is to increase the age at which you start getting the state pension. I mean, I've been retired for 10 years now, and I'm still going strong. Now, it may be not everyone can go on working beyond 75. I mean, I certainly can, and I just wonder, the savings are huge, I think.
We've already got some moves, haven't we, to raise the state pension age that are built in.
And it's worth, I think, the last Labour government and the coalition government did, the Labour government announced the first increases in the state pension age for men since as long as I can remember, and Mr Osborne has sped those increases up, and they are things which will help the long-run financial sustainability of the public finances, and increasing the state pension age looks like a pretty coherent response when the challenge is increasing longevity. And the government's now set in place a process where the default isn't that the state pension age will stay at the ages that they've legislated. It will adapt if longevity surprises us or continues to increase. So I think that's a very sensible thing that the government did that will help the long-run public finances, and probably something that isn't discussed that much, or it doesn't get much credit for doing.
Just one observation on going back to notions of fairness. Actually, in a lot of areas, people assume that the state pension is very difficult to touch, but actually moving its age has proved to actually be politically relatively straightforward, because the arguments really do stack up and make sense to people when you use them. Actually, if you look at some of the work we did with PwC back in 2010, cutting benefits that go towards richer pensioners turns out to be quite an easy argument. I mean, not totally easy, but if you can put that and juxtaposition it towards, well, otherwise we have to cut the education, the benefits of young people, if you make it into grandchildren, it's far easier. You tend to find people tend to actually almost volunteer when they understand the conditions and say, look, this isn't a sensible use of money. I'm not that badly off. We need to do other things with it. So there's some of those political arguments which we tend to have cut out in the election campaign, because we're very, very risk averse in election campaigns about discussions like that.
There's a very interesting quote in a case study we did on the Turner Commission on pensions, which obviously set the ground for that, from Nhs Plan, who was Pensions Minister, that basically the process of the Turner Commission, that independent review taking a long time, publishing its evidence base and whatever, moved the issue of raising the state pension age from a sort of page one shocker, unthinkable within the Department of Work and Pensions, for men at least, not for women, because obviously that had happened a bit earlier, onto something that's page 57. Well, of course you'd do it, wouldn't you? Because people are living longer, so whatever. So I think it's a really interesting question about the process of making some of these big policy changes. Whether you can do that within the term of a 6-month sped up spending review is a different issue. Paul Johnson from the IFS at the front.
It's a question for Julian.
It's a bit hostile. Don't worry, I've got some for Carl. Anyway, yes.
And it's really following on from something you've said 2 or 3 times now about the finance profession within government and better ways of managing things. I just want to press you to say a bit more about the extent to which that's real. And I ask that because, you know, you and I were in the Treasury 10 or more years ago, and I heard exactly the same rhetoric from the, you know, the head of the finance profession and the head of the Treasury at the time, and it's 10 years hence, and I don't know how much, I genuinely don't know how much has changed, but could you say a little bit more about how real some of these potential changes are and your genuine view about whether things will be working differently over the next few years?
Yeah, no, I think you know, the challenge of the Treasury speaketh but does it really mean it is always a kind of interesting one in this world. I think about 2-3 years ago, I mean, the Institute spent a lot of time working on the government finance profession because I think it's one of the key weaknesses of Whitehall, actually. About 3 years ago, I'd have said that the Treasury was a very real and very bizarre blocker on improving the financial capability of Whitehall. It had ceased to hold responsibility for the finance profession, but was acting to prevent anyone else, including Francis Maude, taking up responsibility for improving that profession. I think that switched in 2013. They published a report then, Financial Management in Government report, which reset their viewpoint on it. And the important thing was not so much the report itself, it was some of the appointments they've made into their leadership team, and the fact that it wasn't someone who was leading the finance profession who was actually being internally backing this. It's actually Nick Macpherson, which is a surprise to quite a few people who know Nick over the long run. But he has been very, very positive in his approach in pushing this agenda. And if you look at the other thing that I would just point at, and this is, I'm afraid, minutiae for people who are interested in Whitehall, David Allen, who was brought in, who had been the finance director at BIS, very, very good person, came into the Treasury to lead the finance profession in its improvement when, for various changes, they were reconfiguring. David is now in charge of the teams that are running the spending review. And for anyone who understands the minutiae of Whitehall, having the finance profession person also running the spending review and how it operates is quite a big change. Now, I'm not saying that it's for certain that we're going to sort out capability problems we've been talking about for 50 years or more, but there's certainly much more prospect of it than I would have said if you'd asked me that question 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, I'm going to bring it to a close. I'm just going to ask Carl just one or two little questions, not least since Paul was taking on Julia. You have as your sort of case freezing defence in real terms, but Julia was mentioning problems with the backbenchers, problems the Prime Minister might have. If he comes under pressure to move to the sort of 2% target on defence, having conceded on aid, what does that do to the numbers? Is that material or not very material at all?
Okay, so that's difficult because of exactly what the 2% definition applies to compared to the MOD budget. So we can very easily say, if you freeze the MOD budget, it makes things a bit worse for every other department. If you increase the MOD budget in line with GDP, it would make them even worse for other departments. Whether that would get you to 2% or not might depend on whether you're able to relabel some other activities of government as counting against the 2% or not. My understanding is that we're pretty close or maybe below it already, and therefore any decline as a share of GDP would see us missing it. Whether that matters or not is another
So we
thing.
could be talking a few billion sort of by the end of this period if we were committed to the 2%.
You could easily be adding another 3 or 4% to the cuts you need from other departments.
Now, if I were Nigel Farage sitting here, I would say, well, you know, 2017 referendum, I know it's 56% in favour on a poll today, but, you know, it sort of goes up and down like a yo-yo. There are huge amounts of savings to be met if only we didn't have our pesky EU contribution. I wondered whether you have any comments on scale of that in the numbers. What's the EU contribution in that?
We have not done any assessment of what would happen to the public finances if you left the EU. I don't think that, you know, it's not the net contribution alone. You'd want to think about trade and the impact on the economy, which would presumably dominate.
Okay. Anyway, Julian, I'm going to come back to you, Carl, for final comments. Julian, any comments on
well, I think,
fiscal jokers?
Where we are is quite a big task ahead. There's a huge amount of how you go about this, which is going to involve actually things which are often quite difficult for us. We have to bring people along, the public, the people, the workforce that are actually going to have to make the changes. And actually, we've touched on it a little here. When Paul, when you were asking about the MOD budget, the thought that went through my mind was, well, what do the backbenchers really want? Because I suspect there are enough people in and around the MOD and indeed in and around Parliament who can quite easily brief them on what a real meeting of a 2% commitment in terms of the forces you have is, and what's a lot of funny numbers that are a public announcement of 2%. Which one are the backbenchers actually interested in will be one of those real questions, and trying to do too much funny stuff in this can undermine you very critically as you go forward. So I think the reality of these things really matters, and avoiding doing too much of the show and tell, making really nice fiscal announcements, but then finding that your support for those disappears as the weeks and months go by and people realise what's actually happened.
And Carl, final comments about the challenge facing us.
So I think the challenge is clearly very great. Maybe just to finish, maybe the biggest point, maybe the biggest test is whether on June the 4th, 2020, we're sitting here talking about, now we've eliminated the deficit, what do we do now, tax cuts or spending increases, or whether it's further austerity to come.
Okay, put that date in your diary. Schedulers will come back. So thanks to Julian and Carl for their presentations, but thanks to you all for coming, staying here. I hope that was helpful. I think we'll probably be making both the video of the event and hopefully the slide packs available on the Institute for Government website and probably also on the Institute for Fiscal Studies website. Paul says yes, so that's going to happen. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.